All right. Okay. Pull up the notes. Oh, thank you.
It looks good today. And it's going to be more fun than you started. Yeah, we're tugging it out for any time. It looks like.
Same difference. Yeah, it's letting that process. The process is a little slow. It's like a Commodore 64, but it's working. It's working. All right, so we'll move on to section 3 of the chapter. This is like a 3-parter. All right, so we're now moving from the early Middle Ages officially into the second period called the High Middle Ages, which you probably kind of sensed that as you came in here and felt the electricity. All right, and so yesterday I was talking about feudalism. I hope you got to check that out. And yeah, it was something. And so feudalism was this kind of social contractual system based like on like the idea that you have a lot, this relationship between lord and vassal. All right, so lord was somebody who owned land, right, and then in many cases you don't have like even in the Frankish kingdom like during Charlemagne you kind of divided up into counties stuff like that. You don't these kingdoms and stuff do not have standing professional armies, right? Like in the United States we have like Navy, Air Force, that's like basically those people are paid from the federal government national. But you didn't have that. So what you did was these kings would basically use, or these nobles would use their land, they would give it to a vassal, all right? And then the thing was that the vassal, when called upon, was supposed to generate a military. So many times vassals would take their land and they would parcel it out to other like minor nobles and knights and stuff like that to try to get them to say, hey, I'm giving you this, and I'm gonna need your kind of help here in return. All right, so that system that was kind of started at the end of the kind of High Middle Ages, kind of works its way, or in the early Middle Ages, works its way into the High Middle Ages. But it isn't always clear that usually like the lord is more powerful than a vassal. I gave you that example when Normandy was kind of established. All right, basically that was established when the King of France, Charles the Simple, made King Rollo, the Viking, his vassal by giving him Normandy. Basically, he just gave him Normandy to say, just stop raiding and pillaging. How about that? All right. It was a smart move on his part, right? Basically putting him into the kind of feudal society. And within a few generations, the Normans kind of integrate into that whole kind of concept here. Now, in the High Middle Ages, we start to see the development of actual kind of what we call nation states later. All right. I talked a little bit about that after the Treaty of Verdun. We start to see the trajectory for France and Germany and stuff like that. So I want to talk about England today and how like we start to see how monarchs who are functioning in the feudal system become pretty powerful. And was kind of steering these as kind of like countries rather than just like a collection of fiefdoms. Tomorrow I'll talk about France and Germany, and then Friday I'll end it with talking about Russian history. All right. So in England, all right, the last time I was talking about England here was in the beginning of the chapter, kind of talking about how the Middle Ages was marked by the fact that after the Western Roman Empire broke up, all these various Germanic and Celtic groups kind of took over parts of the dead carcass of the Western Roman Empire. In Roman Britannia, England, Britain there, you had a number of groups, but two groups tend to merge together at one point, and that's the Angles and the Saxons. So they were referred to as Anglo-Saxon. All right, that's the Anglos where we get English from. All right, so they ended up kind of pushing out the Jutes, and then up north we had the Scots that were kind of controlling that area. All right. But then when we were talking about the Vikings, England was ripe for Viking invasion. It was like kind of right there on the North Sea. And a lot of Viking raids were kind of targeted in like real soft kind of targets like monasteries at Lindisfarne and that. And eventually the Vikings stayed on past the summers and they established what they called Dane law there. So the geography of England at that time, you see kind of like right here is where the kind of Viking rule, what they call the Dane law. Here you see kind of like, like Wessex was the kind of the powerful kind of state there, and what we would classify England, Mercia, places like that, and then Northumbria. All right. Now, 1066 is a significant date in English history. That's a date that like everybody, it's like 1776 here. All right. In 1066, the Anglo-Saxon king by the name of Edward the Confessor, he dies without issue. If you ever hear that in like another class or something, or watching something, without issue means without a male heir. Now, at this time, this is primarily a kind of male-dominated society women weren't expected to rule, although later England has strong female queens. But Edward doesn't have a son, all right? And then before he dies, he doesn't signify who he wants to basically succeed. All right, and there's a couple of people that are vying for this. All right, one is his brother-in-law, who's married to Edward's sister, a guy named Harold Godwinson. All right, and Godwinson basically kind of calls together a kind of a meeting of all the kind of like English nobles and barons and stuff, referred to as the Vit. All right, there they determine Godwinson should be king. The problem is there's a couple of people that claim no, we're kind of a relation. One is a Viking king by the name of Harold Hardrada. He's based in kind of Norway, but is basically in England there at the Danelaw. He claims that through Edward's mother's side. And then there's another one in Normandy who claims he's the cousin of Edward. All right. So what ends up happening, here's Harold kind of at the head of the Vit in there. Ends up happening, Harold Hardrada invades England to basically say, I'm the king. Harold Godwinson defeats Harold Hardrada, kills him in battle, and when that happens, the Vikings basically retreat at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in May. However, the guy in Normandy, William I of England, William II of Normandy, is actually planning an invasion, all right, to claim the throne. He's the cousin of Edward the Confessor who died. All right, now he's known in history as the Conqueror. Prior to conquering England, though, he was known by many accounts as William the Bastard, because his father, who was the Duke of Normandy, had him out of wedlock with one of his mistresses. All right, but either way, he claims lineage through. He's a cousin of Edward the Confessor, and also to add on to that, he also claims that Harold Godwinson the year before pledged his fealty to him after he was shipwrecked in Normandy, and pledged on a stack of relics, bones of saints, that Edward the Confessor, that William was Edward's rightful heir. All right. So when William hears that Harold Godwinson has taken the throne, he gets a little upset, and then he decides to invade England. All right. This is often referred to as the Norman invasion. There's an image of William the Conqueror with a sweet mustache. All right. Now, like I said, he's Norman. All right. And the Normans were initially Vikings. Right. But the Norman invasion here is important on many levels. I'm going to play this short video that talks about the Norman invasion of England, but then also kind of Normans in other parts of Europe. And then I'll go back to England
here. In the year 1066, 7,000 Norman infantry and knights sailed in warships across the English Channel. Their target, England, home to more than 1 million people. Theirs was a short voyage with massive consequences. And around the same period of time, other groups of Normans were setting forth all across Europe, going on adventures that would reverberate throughout that continent's history. So who were these warriors, and how did they leave their mark so far and wide? Our story begins over 200 years earlier, when Vikings began to settle on the shores of northern France as part of a great Scandinavian exodus across northern Europe. The French locals called these invaders Normans, named for the direction they came from. Eventually, Charles, the king of the Franks, negotiated peace with the Viking leader Rollo in 911, granting him a stretch of land along France's northern coast that came to be known as Normandy. The Normans proved adaptable to their newly settled life. They married Frankish women, adopted the French language, and soon started converting from Norse paganism to Christianity. But though they adapted, they maintained the warrior tradition and conquering spirit of their Viking forebears. Before long, ambitious Norman knights were looking for new challenges. The Normans' best-known achievement was their conquest of England. In 1066, William, the Duke of Normandy, disputed the claim of the new English king, Harold Godwinson. Soon after landing in England, William and his knights met Harold's army near the town of Hastings. The climactic moment in the battle is immortalized in the 70-meter-long Bayeux Tapestry, where an arrow striking Harold in the eye seals the Norman victory. William consolidated his gains with a huge castle-building campaign and a reorganization of English society. He lived up to his nickname, William the Conqueror, through a massive survey known as the Domesday Book, which recorded the population and ownership of every piece of land in England. Norman French became the language of the new royal court, while commoners continued to speak Anglo-Saxon. Over time, The two merged to give us the English we know today, though the divide between lords and peasants can still be felt in synonym pairs such as cow and beef. By the end of the 12th century, the Normans had further expanded into Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Meanwhile, independent groups of Norman knights traveled to the Mediterranean, inspired by tales of pilgrims returning from Jerusalem. There, they threw themselves into a tangled mass of conflicts among the established powers all over that region. They became highly prized mercenaries, and during one of these battles, they made the first recorded heavy cavalry charge with couched lances, a devastating tactic that soon became standard in medieval warfare. The Normans were also central to the First Crusade of 1095 to 99, a bloody conflict that re-established Christian control in certain parts of the Middle East. But the Normans did more than just fight. As a result of their victories, leaders like William Ironarm and Robert the Crafty secured lands throughout southern Italy, eventually merging them to form the Kingdom of Sicily in 1130. Under Roger II, the kingdom became a beacon of multicultural tolerance in a world torn apart by religious and civil wars. Muslim Arab poets and scholars served in the royal court alongside Byzantine Greek sailors and architects. Arabic remained an official language along with Latin, Greek, and Norman French. The world's geographical knowledge was compiled in the Book of Roger, whose maps of the known world would remain the most accurate available for 300 years. And the churches built in Palermo combined Latin-style architecture, Arab ceilings, and Byzantine domes, all decorated with exquisite golden mosaics. So if the Normans were so successful, why aren't they still around? In fact, this was a key part of their success, not just ruling the societies they conquered, but becoming part of them. Although the Normans eventually disappeared as a distinct group, their contributions remained. And today, from the castles and cathedrals that dot Europe's landscape to wherever the English language is spoken, the Norman legacy lives on.
All right, so back to England here. 1066. William decides, I'm going to invade England to claim the crown. This is known as the Battle of Hastings. That's really the only, when they say Norman invasion, it's synonymous with Battle of Hastings. There's only one battle. All right, so tough year for Godwinson after taking the crown. He has to defeat the Vikings, and then a few months later, he has to turn around and take on the Normans. All right, he is killed in battle, though. He's the first of only 3 English kings who die actually in battle. The thing about the Hastings is it puts William on the throne. He is not just the Duke of Normandy now, he is the King of England as well, combining those 2 realms. Also, it's believed after kind of conquering the rest of what is Danelaw that this ends the Scandinavian influence here in England, which is irony because William, just his stock, his ethnicity, just a few generations before was Viking, if you will. All right, so this is why it's significant in the sense of its history here. Also, too, the thing about the Battle of Hastings that it's kind of unique. It's documented actually on the only documented battle on a big quilt called the Bayeux Tapestry, which is about 230 feet long. All right, and so it basically goes in a kind of a panel, kind of a panorama. So this is the quilt of it, and it's called Bayeux Tapestry. It's in the Cathedral of Bayeux in Normandy, in France. These are the Normans coming across the English Channel. These are the Norman knights, which gave them a distinct advantage. But actually, the word knight actually comes from what the Anglo-Saxons called these guys knights. All right, and that's later kind of morphs into knights because everywhere else they were referred to by the French name is chevalier, all right, like where we get cavalier from. All right, so they have a distinct advantage over the primarily kind of like men-at-arms, foot soldiers that the Anglo-Saxons, Godwinson has. This panel is interesting in the sense that they believe at the top right corner there, this is the first documentation of Halley's Comet, which was that comet comes every 75 years. Last time it came was like in 1989. And in history, in ancient times, comets were viewed as omens. So this was indicating that the same year, 1066, when the Halley's Comet came, that this was an omen foretelling the kind of Norman invasion there. And then on this panel shows Harold actually dying in battle, being shot in the face with an arrow, right? Shot in the eye. Kind of see him kind of holding that there. Now, what does William do here, in a sense, is that as kind of like the kind of conquering England, he reorganizes their feudal system there. He kind of takes land from certain English nobles, redistributes it to Norman followers. So you have like Normans who who have land in France as well in England here. All right, but then he does give some back to some English nobles in the sense of basically kind of making sure they kind of pledge their fealty. All right, so what we have here 20 years later, officially this idea where the King of England is the preeminent lord of the land. There's a kind of a issue called the Oath of Salisbury. You guys ever had Salisbury steak? That's where it comes. That's the Salisbury in that. So in this, it's basically all lords, no matter who you're kind of got your land from, would essentially basically kind of pledge their ultimate fealty to the king. Now, in certain cases in feudal societies, all right, so let's say I'm king here, Isaiah here is my vassal. I give him a big tract of land here and says, if I call upon you, I'm going to need you to, basically come ride with me, right? And so what Isaiah is going to do, he's going to go to Scott and say, hey, I got some land here. I'm going to need to call upon you, all right? Like if I need to now, and let's say at one point, me and Isaiah have beef. All right, and we go to war, which it would happen at times. You have like rebellious nobles and stuff. So what I do, what Isaiah would normally do, is go to Scott. On the Oath of Salisbury, I would pass over Isaiah and go straight to Scott and say, "You're fighting with me. You're riding with me." All right. So it's basically no matter, despite Isaiah giving you that land, ultimately I'm the one who calls off the shots, rocks on the rocks. All right, and that was kind of what established the King of England as the preeminent lord. All right. At other times, that wasn't always the case in feudalism. Another thing in 1086 that also solidified the kind of strength of the monarchy there was a compiling of all the landed wealth, the register of wealth called the Doomsday Book. Initially, it was known as Domesday from the French. As time went on, it kind of morphed into an English Doomsday Book. This is basically like a census, all right, to see what the nobles got, mainly for the purposes of taxation, all right, because even still, you're calling upon people for basically kind of like military service. It costs money to kind of run a war, and so you're going to need money, and a lot of that money obviously comes from taxation. All right, so when you have strong kings, they tend to kind of garner this kind of taxation. When you have weaker ones, we see kind of like noble revolts that occur at various times. But 1086 is significant here for that. I think a couple years later, actually, William died. The story was that he was. By the time he died, and the time he was interned into his coffin in the cathedral in Normandy, it was about a week, I think, so he became real bloated. And the story was they basically tried to shove his body into this coffin, but it was too big, and his body bursted. And people had to leave the cathedral because it was like stinking. Now you really didn't need to know that. I just wanted to tell that story because I like that story.
It'd be like that.
There's a kind of a copy of the Domesday Book, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was written in Latin. Latin still was spoken and they were like used in the church and for government kind of purposes. Another important king to kind of strengthen the position of the monarchy is William's great grandson. That's Henry II. Right. So he becomes king almost like 100 years later, all right, 1154. Uh-oh, is that okay? All right, I scared me. I don't know what else. But it was like a bomb.
A bomb, yeah.
Yeah, like one of those like a
pipe bomb.
torpedo that fell. It's like
A torpedo.
so he was instrumental in basically strengthening kind of the court system in England. Now, part of feudalism is one of the jobs that vassals had to lords in many cases was to establish courts, these local courts to decide disputes and stuff like that. Henry wanted to kind of get away from that, to establish one that's more kind of like where adherent to the monarchy, to the king himself. All right. There's Henry. He's got a little bit of a double chin. That happens to us as we get older. And his contribution here is the establishment of the jury system. All right. So he introduces in these royal courts, all right, and having kind of royal officials basically kind of reporting back to the king and such he has these this jury, this 12-man jury of people that tended to be basically kind of like they're aware of the situation. There was like a dispute of something. Now, this is where we get the idea, but the jury system that we have is a little bit different. Like, so for our juries, you're not supposed to know about the case or have any connection to anybody involved. I've told the story all day, so I'm just going to tell it to you guys. It's a personal story. I came to the conclusion after telling the story that I have a talent not just for boring teenagers with useless historical facts, but also with personal stories of my own. So check it. I've done jury duty twice. It's a flex, I know, but don't you guys will get there. And so first time I did it was in the mid 90s. I'm in my 20s, you know, I'm like jury duty. Yep, that's all I'm about it. And so I remember we go to St. Clair County Courthouse. At that time, they put you in a big room. It seemed like there's like 100 something people there. And then when a case come up, they would just randomly pick numbers. You'd have like a number tag. So I got picked for the jury pool. So they take you into the courtroom. There's 24 of you. All right, and what they'll have is the judge, and then the defendant, the defense attorneys, and the prosecuting attorney. So I remember the defendant was there. The case was he robbed somebody at knife point. All right, so the judge is like basically explaining rules, and then he tells like asks does first they'll ask does any lawyers, like the defense attorney asks, has anybody here been a victim of a crime? And like somebody, a couple people raise their hands. Now the defense attorney was probably not one of those people on the jury because he's afraid that their personal experiences may cloud their judgment with this. All right. But then they asked, does anybody know like the defendant? One lady raises her hand and she's like, that's my cousin. And she just the whole time I just remember looking over at her and she was just shaking her head. It was a big dude. I remember just like kind of looking down like he was kind of embarrassed because his cousin was there. Then they asked, does anybody know the lawyers? Nobody answered the question. And then the lawyers, the judge asked it. Then the defense attorney starts asking questions, and then he comes to me. He goes, juror number 23. And he's like, state your name. I stated my name. He goes, do you know James Randall? And I said, he goes, Mount Vernon, Illinois. I go, yes. He goes, how so? I go, that's my brother. He goes, do you know Charles Randall, deceased? I go, yes. He goes, how so? I go, that was my father. And he goes, juror number 23, were you aware that from the ages of 13 to 18, I spent nearly every weekend in your parents' basement on Church Lane in East St. Louis, and your dad coached me in football? And I said, no, because my brother was 14 years older than me. So I didn't know that. So I was like, I'm not going to get on the case. And then also to add to that, the judge stated, he was like, that, and I knew this, that his son and my nephew were like best friends. All right. So I went back to the big jury pool, never got called for that. Fast forward 20 years, 2016, going into jury duty, same defense attorney. This was like over just domestic dispute. So the question goes, does anybody know the lawyers? And I raised my hand. I said, I don't know Mr. Ruscio personal, but he's a friend of my brother. So I was thinking, okay, I'm done. I could probably go home after all this thing. I got picked for the 12-man jury. All right. Mainly because the two prosecuting attorneys, they had two dudes. They were super young. They were really wet behind. Do you ever I'm not trying to dog it because I was horrible as a student teacher. Would you ever have a student teacher and it's like you're just like kind of cringing, just like kind of like like this? That was kind of how these guys were. It seemed like it was their first case, So I think they forgot that so when he had that opportunity, he picked me. Now that didn't cloud my, the case was kind of a mess, but it was also kind of weird. After we make our decision, in which he, the defendant was found not guilty, I'm walking out, and my brother he was going through cancer treatment at the time. And so the defense attorney, he kind of popped. I was walking out. He goes, "Hey, he goes, could you wait around a little bit? Ask about see how your brother's doing and stuff." Like right in front of the judge, which I thought that was kind of weird, but whatever. The case was kind of a mess. Yeah. Those two dudes were not going to challenge that whatsoever. So that long, boring, personal story only relates to the fact that it was about a jury duty. All right, but this comes to Henry II. So there's a straight line from me serving jury duty to the King of England in the 12th century. All right, now the deal is that what he's trying to ultimately do here with these decisions made in these royal courts is establishing kind of a legal code that's more kind of a national legal code, if you would call it common law. All right, the problem is that and this is it's supposed to everybody under the realm. All right, should be adhered to common law, and the King of England is kind of like the head of that. The problem with that is that the church also has its own legal code. All right, it's called canon law. And Henry believes that, the church is, there, and, they are in this realm and should adhere to this law. The papacy says, no, we have our own separate code. We only answer to God, the Pope, So in England at the time, the highest office for the church, the representative of the Pope in England, was the Archbishop of Canterbury. At that time, in 1164, Henry's friend, a guy he knew, Thomas of Becket, became Archbishop of Canterbury. So he's thinking, all right, he's going to see things how I see them. Not so. Thomas made it clear that his adherence, his allegiance is first to God, then the Pope, and then his king. All right. So this created a power struggle between church and state. So what ends up happening here is Henry has and there's a meeting of the court with various nobles. All right. He makes an offhanded comment after finding out that this is just getting nowhere. And he's like, "Would someone just rid me of this meddlesome priest?" When he refers to him as priest, the Archbishop of Canterbury, it's an insult. It's an archbishop. All right. So according to the histories, these four young knights, these four kind of lower level nobles, decide that they're going to endear themselves to Henry, and they're going to go to Canterbury and just rough up Becket. Unfortunately, things got handed to him. All right, they murder him. All right, and Becket is basically martyred. He's considered a saint. All right, Henry has to back away from that kind of that power struggle between the church. He has to make penance with the Pope, and then he's also got one of his sons revolting against him. All right, so he's kind of deal with all this stuff. But he does, eventually common law becomes part of the kind of legal code that we have there in England. All right, now he is succeeded by his son, Richard II. It's Richard first. He's known as Richard the Lionheart. I'll talk about it in more detail when we talk about the Crusades. He spends most of his time on military campaign in the Middle East, all right? He dies on his way back, all right? His brother, John, becomes king in 1199, all right? Now, John is, for most accounts in English history, is one of the bad kings of England. All right. Did you ever watch anything related to Robin Hood? That's the King John and Robin Hood. All right. John is also going to spend a lot of time on military campaign against France and the emergence of the kind of French colony, which we'll talk about tomorrow. And he loses Normandy to Philip Augustus. He loses basically the family home, if you will. All right. So he's referred to in history in often cases John Lackland or John Softsoul. The problem is that he's got to make up this all the money he's spent and his brother has spent by issuing heavy taxes. And those taxes are going to mainly come from the nobles. And this is going to he's going to run into problems, and his nobles are going to revolt. All right? And they're going to get the upper hand, and eventually they're going to make him sign an important document that is not just important to English history, but American history, and that's the Magna Carta.
This may look like a plain, unassuming piece of parchment, but is actually one of the most famous documents in the world. Magna Carta, meaning the Great Charter, has inspired people across the centuries, from Thomas Jefferson to Mahatma Gandhi. But why was the Charter originally created, and what does it actually say? Let us take you back to medieval England. It's the year 1215, and the ruler is King John. Many people believe that King John was one of the worst kings in history. He imprisoned his former wife, he starved his opponents to death, he allegedly murdered his own nephew, and pulled the beards of the Irish chiefs. King John had imposed heavy taxes on his barons in order to pay for his expensive foreign wars. If they refused to pay, he punished them severely or seized their property. The barons demanded that King John obey the law. When he refused, they captured London, and John was forced to negotiate. The two sides met at Runnymede in June 1215. The result of the negotiations was written down by the king's clerks into the document we know as Magna Carta. Although most of the Charter's clauses dealt with medieval rights and customs, Magna Carta has become a powerful symbol of liberty around the world. The most famous clause, which is still part of the law today, for the first time gave all free men the right to justice and a fair trial. No man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by the judgment of their equals and by the law of the land. To no one will we sell. However, this clause was not as liberal as it sounds. The Charter only applied to free men. The vast majority of people in 1215 were unfree peasants who were ruled over by their landowners. And although Magna Carta was intended to create peace between King John and his rebellious barons, England was plunged into civil war after the popes declared the Charter invalid. When King John died of dysentery in 1216, 9-year-old Henry III took to the throne. To keep the peace, Magna Carta was reissued several times during the 13th century, until it was finally made part of English law. Magna Carta has lived on for 800 years and is echoed in the United States Declaration of Independence and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Perhaps Magna Carta's most important legacy is that everyone, including our leaders, must obey the law. What started out as a document of specific complaints from a group of barons has turned into an international symbol of liberty, without which we might not have the rights we value so much today.
All right, so that document is famously the Magna Carta, Great Charter. And you guys probably talked about this probably briefly in like your government classes, kind of the early chapters there of government. So like I said, this was signed by John under duress, basically after the kind of the nobles kind of gained the upper hand on him with some victories, right? And so it was signed in this meadow called Runnymede. The deal was this was to limit the absolute power of the king, of the monarch, all right, particularly when it comes to taxation, but also importantly with the idea of like things that we take from it, like the Fifth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. The Magna Carta is basically all over that, with that concept of due process and the right to a jury trial and stuff like that. All right, there's a kind of a copy of it written on parchment. All right, there's him signing it, running me. But most importantly, like it also kind of this issue, kind of the idea that taxes in particular, that he can only tax the nobles with their consent, meaning their approval. With that, we had this idea that's called no taxation without representation. Where else have you heard that from?
The Revolutionary War.
Revolution, exactly. So our founding fathers, who were well versed in, basically used an English law, an English documented law, to argue that England was violating their rights. They're basically saying we didn't vote for the Stamp Act, we didn't vote for the Tea Act, right? And right there they use what we call precedent to make that solid argument. All right. So like I said, Magna Carta is not just important in English history; it's important in American history as well. All right. Now, the last king I'll talk about that's kind of strengthening the position of the monarchy is a king that becomes king in the mid part of the 13th century, and that's Edward I. All right. He has some cool kind of nicknames, mainly through his conquest of Scotland and Wales. He doesn't have a great reputation in Scotland in particular. He's referred to as the Hammer of the Scots. All right. And so, he's a Longshanks because of his kind of military. He was big on basically kind of like total annihilation almost. All right. He's also pretty cunning. He's kind of pretty smart here. His grandson we'll talk about is the one who's going to basically invade France for what we refer to as the 100 Years' War. And then we start to see more kind of merging of England and France, and particularly like at this time, England, the King of England also owns a number of like kind of fiefdoms in France there. So there's that word. This is an interesting illustration. This shows him crowning his son, who is Edward II, as his heir as the Prince of Wales. All right. Now, the Prince of Wales today is the rightful heir to the English crown. All right. This occurs after under the reign of Edward when he conquers Wales. The Welsh have their own language, their own kind of like they had their own kind of like nobility and stuff. So after he conquered Wales, he made like to try to cloak his conquering in this like legitimacy. He told the Welsh nobles that they will have a kind of a Prince of Wales. They'll have somebody that kind of will represent them. All right, and so they kind of agreed to this. A few months later, he comes back with his infant son, who's Edward II, and the Welsh nobles like, "What the hell is that? That's a baby." All right, and so before this, he made an agreement saying, "I will have the Prince of Wales will be somebody born in Wales and not speak English, because by this time English becomes a more dominant language." And so the deal is he presents this baby. So one, he was born in Wales while he was on a military campaign. All right, so he was born on Welsh land, and two, he doesn't speak English. Why is that? He's a baby. You don't speak. All right. So he kind of pulled up. He was kind of slipped there. So still to this day, the Prince of Wales was established by Edward I is the heir to the English throne. All right. Today it's Prince Charles, who's been in the news for all the wrong reasons. All right. The thing that is important for Edward here, and this kind of strengthening position of the kingship, is establishing something called a model parliament. We are into the High Middle Ages. And I'll talk about this in more detail. In the High Middle Ages, we start to see a new class of people emerge within European society. All right, and that's what they call the townspeople, or in England they call them burgesses. In France they call them bourgeoisie. In Germany and the Holy Roman Empire they call them burghers. These are merchants. These are people who make money off of selling things and stuff, more portable wealth rather than land. So Edward is constantly trying to cloak his kind of like his reign in legitimacy here. So what he does is creates this council that has all these groups of kind of English society meeting, and they kind of come to certain agreements, if you will. He uses the burgesses to basically offset the influence of nobles, clergies, and knights. All right, so he's starting to get away from that, trying to kind of transition out of like that kind of feudal kind of influence there. All right. You've ever seen? Anyone ever seen the movie Braveheart? It's a movie. Yeah, that's the king in Braveheart, the old guy.
Wait,
He's the old dude, Longshanks. He's the guy in that scene where he throws the one dude out of the window.
yeah.
Oh, and also too, do you guys know what throwing somebody out of a window is called? Like when you throw somebody, it's called defenestration. Just so you can add that to your vocabulary.
That's a big word.
Yeah. So if you get mad at somebody and you throw them out a window, you say you got defenestrated.